Even though on surface it looked like the Western protest, urban protest, but then they adopt a conservative Confucianist language of we are complaining about the local officials and we are repeating the emperor, and the emperor and the protesters share the same language. The emperor was the grandfather, and then local officials is the parents, and then the people were the grandkids. So it is the family hierarchy. In which this protester portrayed themselves as a kind of little grandkids complaining about their parents to their grandparents.
It's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Ho-fung, and the focus of his lecture. It's hard to make sense of the world today in any way without grappling with China. Starting in the 1980s, the post-Maoist regime of Deng Xiaoping began to restructure its economy and society in fundamental ways. Agricultural reforms and massive investment in labor-intensive manufacturing and physical infrastructure generated decades of rising exports and rapid economic growth. China's structural transformation into the shop floor of the world lifted millions of its citizens out of poverty while creating a massive urban middle class and a boom in the number of millionaires and billionaires that entered the global 1%. Many observers and policymakers in the West believed that economic modernization and global integration would eventually encourage popular support for political liberalization to deepen even further, and eventually a transition to democracy. Yet the last 2 decades have witnessed a series of political changes in the other direction. The administration of Hu Jintao reversed many personal freedoms that expanded in the 1990s while constricting rights lawyers and social activists. Since assuming the leadership, Xi Jinping has entrenched power in his own hands, expanding the party's reach into society. Authorities have sought to silence opposition and dissent in the name of political stability and national unity, most significantly in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Campaigns against high-level corruption, as well as economic inequality, have purged hundreds of high-ranking officials in the party, including just in the last week, while reducing the wealth and clout of many financial titans. The Made in China agenda, which aimed to make the country the global leader in 10 next-generation sectors by this year, 2025, has deepened the role of the state. Yet China's economy is also slowing down. Its debt burden is staggering, roughly 365% of GDP in 2024. And its population is now falling, reflecting the long-term effects of its one-child policy, creating a demographic predicament. Added to these domestic challenges are international pressures. Today, many in the West accuse China of violating the rules of the international order and weaponizing its trading relations. They see its intensifying rivalry with the United States, which itself has imposed steep tariffs and export restrictions on many goods to China, as an ideological conflict between opposite political systems and a new Cold War. Yet the United States itself is suffering from severe democratic regression, as we in Canada know all too well. Many fear this clash of empires may spiral into a real war. How are the current economic crises testing the resilience of China's authoritarian system? What role does escalating US-China competition play in China's current political trajectory? How might internal contradictions within its developmental model create openings for political transformation that conventional wisdom overlooks? Our guest this evening has studied these questions and many others for many years, each a dimension of the so-called China question. Ho-fung is the Henry and Elizabeth Wiesenfeld Professor of Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches in the Sociology Department and the School of Advanced International Studies. Trained at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the State University of New York Binghamton, and Johns Hopkins, Professor Hung is a prolific scholar, the author of many award-winning books that have been translated into 7 languages. These include titles such as Protests with Chinese Characteristics, Demonstrations, Riots, and Petitions in the Mid-Qing Dynasty, The China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World, and Clash of Empires, from Chimerica to the new Cold War. His articles have appeared in leading academic journals such as the American Journal of Sociology, Development and Change, and Review of International Political Economy, while his analyses of Chinese political economy and Hong Kong politics are frequently cited in leading media around the world, from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to the BBC, the Straits Times in Singapore, and Xinhua Monthly in China itself. His newest book, to be released in early 2026, is The China Question: 8 Centuries of Fantasy and Fear. Ho-fung will speak for about half an hour. I'll then start a conversation with him to explore some of the issues raised in his talk before we open the floor to your questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ho-fung Han.
I'm not going to talk a lot about the contemporary politics. Probably we'll get into that in the dialogue section in the second half, and also in the Q&A. I will talk about ideas and history that when we talk about China, or so-called when we talk about the China question, actually there's a perennial conception about China as a perennial land of dictatorships and lack of freedom and collectivism and so on and so forth. And it dates back all the way to during the Enlightenment, and then Montesquieu and Hegel, Marx, and all the way to Vogel and this thesis of Oriental despotism. And also in the literature about the contemporary Chinese politics, the authoritarian party-state regime, the literature, scholarly study of Chinese politics has been shifting from the prospect of democratization to why the authoritarian system is so resilient, so in comparison to many other authoritarian regimes around the world. So we are talking about democratic authoritarian backsliding, or democratic backsliding, or authoritarian revival in China, that it seems like in the modern period, authoritarianism is never go away and it's always there. But that is this the first slide, and it's just like 2 images to remind you actually that it is not that gripping. There's also always moments of aspiration for democracy, and the first one is the image that Sanjay used also in one of the flyers of this event. That is the 1979 the Beijing democracy war movement in 1979. So right after not long after Mao died and the Gang of Four was arrested, and Deng Xiaoping became the new leader, and people are wondering what he's going to do as the new leader to China. And then the first instinct of the intellectuals and workers, at least in the big cities, that they want political modernization, they want liberalization, they want democracy, democratization. And then Deng Xiaoping in the beginning was wavering and not showing whether they are repressing it or supporting it, but in the end that they decided to suppress it and round up the people, and then really focus the energy on economic reform and economic freedom, not political freedom. So the line is set very, very hard. That is, we will do some market reform and liberalize the economy, but not politics. And so but then the rest is history, of course, that the aspiration didn't die and then continue up and down over the 1980s until the tragedy in 1989. And then after 1989, that basically it is a very stable, long march of the authoritarianization of the regime until today is what you see. It's a kind of a Xi Jinping era. But regardless, that throughout this period, we see this kind of a periodic sparkle of aspiration or expression of aspiration for more political freedom. And then the image on the right is probably less well known to people who are paying a lot of attention to contemporary Chinese politics, but this guy is Li Ji. That is a kind of a late 16th century Confucianist scholar official. He's a very interesting fellow. After he quit his job as a government official, and he went back to the countryside kind of setting and write books. And one of the books he wrote is called a book for burning, because it's so heretic. So it is going to be a book to be burned. And so in it, he subverts all this Confucianist traditional idea of hierarchy between men and women, senior people and junior people, So he subverted all this hierarchy and think that everybody should be equal, and has an equal kind of a pathway to enlightenment and to truth. So that is a very heretic kind of Confucianist understanding of the world at the time. And of course, he is part of the larger movement of the Wang Yangming school of Confucianism that actually defy kind of authoritarian, top-down kind of education of the Confucianist academy, and emphasize the individual reflection and enlightenment, so much so that some contemporary China historian call this school of Confucianism as a kind of a Chinese version of Reformation. And then the leader of the school, Wang Yangming, is some contemporary Chinese scholar call him the Martin Luther of China. And then the rest is history again, that Li Ji is the radical wing of this school. And then he later, in modern scholarship, and his branch of the Confucianist school is called the Mad Zen school of Confucianism, because it get a lot of influence of Buddhism as well. But in the end, that the authority find his books too heretic and too destabilizing and arrest him, and he in the end commit suicide in the prison in the late at the turn of the 17th century. And then the Ming dynasty collapsed, and then the Qing dynasty came in and established a kind of a more orthodox and conservative version of Confucianism as the orthodoxy. So actually that there's a lot of this kind of a moment, even in the long, supposedly Oriental despotic history of China. There's also this moment of sparkles of yearning for freedom, and his work is actually later being revived and rediscovered in the early 20th century in the Republican China for a group of democratic Confucianist scholars, of course, that who don't want to have dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek, and they don't want a communist kind of dictatorship as well, so they are trying to find a kind of elements of individual freedom and democracy in the traditional Confucianist canon. So there's all this kind of a moment and sparkles, but regardless, we are still stuck with this kind of a image of China as a perennial dictatorship. And talking about the China and democracy, there are three myths, and I am focusing on the third one. Then I don't have time to go over the first two. The first one is, of course, that it's very common that people just assume that economic crisis could lead to regime destabilization. First of all, that I published this book in the book was copyrighted 2016 and was published actually in late 2015. So when I get the book cover in the beginning, I get a cold feet that with a deflated balloon. That because in the book I said very clearly at that time I was a minority, saying that China is heading toward a long slowdown and economic crisis. That is kind of more like Japan after the 1990s, but more serious than Japan. At that time, most people don't believe in this analysis and think that China will have 30 more years of double-digit growth. But in the end, I was verified. And now everybody knows that China is a big economic slowdown. But at the same time, that also in 2015, a very renowned political scientist in U.S., David Shambaugh, wrote this article in the Wall Street Journal called "The Coming Crack Up of the Chinese Regime." Not exactly the name of the title, but it's a coming crack up of the Chinese state, something like that. And then so he predicted that the economic slowdown, if any, will destabilize the regime. So it's always this kind of myth about that economic slowdown can break the regime of the Communist Party state. But then in 2016-17, there's a foreign policy symposium that I participated in. I actually advocated opposite argument that actually the authoritarian regime of the CCP will be strengthened in a kind of economic slowdown. Because it's not always the case that economic crisis can weaken an authoritarian regime. If they crack down hard, and then with all this infrastructure of control well in place, actually an economic crisis can weaken the middle class, weaken the private economy, and then the state can actually prevail. You look at North Korea, look at Venezuela, Iran, and even Russia, that they have been in a long economic crisis for like more than a decade, but their authoritarian regime still defy all these predictions about collapse. So I'm basically making the case that if anything, that the economic crisis, if deepened, if continue in China, it will probably move China to what more like a North Koreanization situation, that is a more draconian control of the society. So it is one myth that economic crisis wouldn't lead to regime destabilization. So, and of course, and another myth that I deal with in my more recent little book, Clash of Empires, is that the current U.S.-China or Western China rivalry, many people say that it is a new Cold War based on ideology, based on political regime difference, but it is not the case, because you look at after Tiananmen, with all this horrific image of the tank running on the streets and civilians get shot, and there's a shocking moment in the Western society about how brutal the regime is. It didn't stop first the senior Bush administration and then the Clinton administration from doing business with China. So, and even the geopolitical tension in the 1990s over Taiwan, over South China Sea, didn't derail the coming closer together between U.S. economy and Chinese economy, and they become more integrated, and there's huge enthusiasm among the business elite, political elite to deal with China. So in the 1990s and also in the 2000s, after China got into WTO in 2001, that the China authoritarian regime is always tightening control, but it didn't create any problem for Washington or for any other Western country to continue to have a good relation with China. So I argue that basically now the foundation of the U.S.-China deteriorating relations is not about values, it's not about political system, but about economic competition, that in the 1990s and 2000s, U.S. corporations and Western corporations is having a good time making money in collaboration with Chinese corporation, but then Chinese corporation very fast, according to your perspective, learn or stole many of the trade secrets and technology of the Western company, and because of the nature of the regime, they can produce things at a much lower cost. The latest example is I keep talking about, and people talking about, is like rare earth, that why China can establish monopoly of the rare earth, because rare earth is not rare. It's like a lot of places have rare earth, but actually it's very, very environmentally contaminating to dig it up and to process it. And so much so that U.S. has a lot of rare earth, raw rare earth that they dig up, and it is so intoxicating to process it. So they actually export to China to process and then import it back. Because it is only under kind of a regime that you can contaminate the underground water, the river, and then the people get poisoned and get all this devastation without any issues, and also do it very cheaply. So it is this kind of cost advantage of the Chinese economy that they can easily outcompete Western companies. So these corporations start to find the Chinese corporations very competitive, not only in Chinese market, but later on in the world market, in the Belt and Road country, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in Europe. Then they turn their view about China from being a cheerleader of Chinese interests in the lobbying circuit of Washington to at least being silent, no longer lobby for Chinese interests in the U.S. political system. So it is the economic competition that set the deterioration going, the deterioration of relations between U.S. and China. And then the third mystery about China is that liberal democracy doesn't fit Chinese conditions. So it is the thing that I deal with in my the book that Sanjay talked about is going to be out in February 2026. Basically, that it is this kind of Orientalist conception that actually Chinese culture is incompatible with individual freedom and democracy. And actually, at first, it is a Western Orientalist idea, but then the Chinese elite from the KMT, the Kuomintang, the nationalist government in Chiang Kai-shek, to all the way to Xi Jinping now, they adopt this kind of a Western Orientalist idea and to justify the authoritarian system. So today I will focus on a little history of this kind of a Western conception that the Chinese culture is not compatible with individual freedom and democracy. And first, that is this kind of a Chinese and English text from the Chinese propaganda machine and official media. In recent years, as in the 1990s and early 2000s, but now intensifying in recent years, that they're just saying that China and Western countries are fundamentally different in terms of personality, in terms of culture, in terms of everything. So the Chinese system cannot kind of try to copy anything that is Western. So China has to have its own very particular path of political governance. So it is the national condition. 国情 is a very key word that they use. So China has its special condition. You cannot try to replicate anything that seems to be working in other countries, in the Western country, and introduce it in China. So it is the huge campaign against what they call universal values. There's no such thing as universal value. So actually it is forbidden to talk about universal value. It is a kind of a color revolution conspiracy. Whenever you talk about universal value, it means that you try to impose Western system and Western values on China. That will never work because we have different culture, we have different individual ideas about everything. So that is now very common in the Chinese propaganda. But actually, I trace back the origin of this idea. I can trace it back in the modern time in the 20th century to one person, Frank Goodnow. It is a very interesting fellow that he graduated in Amherst College in late 19th century and then went to law school and then started teaching at Columbia University. And then actually he became the first president of the American Political Science Association. So he's one of the founding father of the political science. And he has a lot of contribution, and real scholarly contribution like administrative law, comparative politics, and today American Political Science Association still has a Frank Goodnow Award to award to people who have like public service, distinguished public service as a political scientist. And of course that I get interested in him because he was the president of my home university. And he made a lot of important contribution to the reforming the university curriculum and set up the International Relations School that is the predecessor of the Advanced School of International Studies today. But more importantly, so it is the obituary when he died in the 1930s in the New York Times, talk about all his contribution. But then he's also aided the Chinese Republic, and in the subtitle of the obituary. So how come he aided the Chinese Republic? Because he has a moonlighting job when he was the president of the university, that he was a special legal advisor to Chinese president at the time, Yuan Shikai. As you know, that but actually that he didn't apply for the job. There's no job opening, that he didn't need to apply. It's just like Yuan Shikai. You know that after the 1911 revolution, that Sun Yat-sen was the idealist. He didn't have military power. So he's from the south. And then Yuan Shikai was the kind of a Lei Ching warlord who controlled the North China fleet. So he is the man with muscle. So Sun Yat-sen decided that without this military strongman support, that the republic will not survive. So Sun Yat-sen let him become the Chinese president. So Sun Yat-sen, for the sake of the republic, that he make a compromise and give the power to Yuan Shikai. And then Yuan Shikai was a military strongman. He's not interested in democracy at all. So he tried to establish kind of a lifelong presidency of himself. And later on, he tried to revive the monarchy. And then, but that it faced a lot of opposition from the intellectuals, from the public in China at the time. So it is actually very helpful that to get a prominent scholars, Caucasian scholar from the US to tell the Chinese public that actually democracy is not suitable for China. So it sounds more convincing than a Chinese military strongman tell you democracy doesn't fit us, then nobody believes. But you get American renowned scholars and come. So he looked for this kind of advisor to help him change. And then the Harvard president who later found the Carnegie the Endowment for International Peace, Charles Eliot, actually that under Charles Eliot idea and persuasion that Frank Goodenough became the legal advisor to President Yuan Shikai. So here is just what most of you might know, and I just talk about that is the 1911 revolution, and then but then the Republic of China was proclaimed that Yuan Shikai was the president after with President of Sun Yat-sen, and then at the same time, as a kind of a mechanism to check the presidential power, that there is also a National Assembly, a parliament, with free election, and then the Nationalist Party, the KMT, won majority, but then the majority leader in the parliament got assassinated, and then Yuan implemented a new constitution in 1913, giving himself lifelong presidency, and then sweeping executive power, all under the advice of Frank Goodenough. And in 1914, then Yuan dissolved the National Assembly. 1915, Yuan created a hand-picked National Assembly, adopted a new constitution to restore monarchy with himself and the emperor, but then other warlords didn't agree. And then Yuan, under the pressure of other military strongmen in the provinces, abdicated, and then so he was an emperor only for a very short period of time, and then he died of sickness in June. And the rest is history. And then China descended into civil war, and then we all know how it ended up. So that the Frank Goodenough is interesting. So it is like a local newspaper in Baltimore at the time, showing Yuan Shikai and Frank Goodenough as a walrus and the carpenter. So it is like a children's song in the U.S. that's about the walrus and the carpenter spitting out nonsense to attract all these unsuspecting oyster to come and listen. You have a point, and then they eat them all. So it is basically a way to show that Frank Goodenough is like collaborating with Yuan Shikai to lure this unsuspecting Chinese public to come to this cause of restoring the monarchy and then eat them all. So it is in Baltimore Sun. It is like a local newspaper making fun of the new president of the university that has this kind of a connection with destroying the republic in China. So it is Yuan Shikai before he died, and in his brief period as a new emperor of China. So actually that is really interesting because Frank Goodenough published a kind of a memo to Yuan Shikai to explain why he thinks that democracy is not a good idea, is contrary to Chinese characteristics. And then the Yuan Shikai and his supporter who want to have monarchy translate his memo into Chinese, into this pamphlet called it On Republic and Monarchy, and become a kind of propaganda to get ready for Yuan Shikai declaring the monarchy, restoration of monarchy. And then in that memo, Frank Goodenough just think that the conditions are different in China and America. And it is in the word of Frank Goodenough in his memo to Yuan Shikai, that the conditions are different in China and America, and it is impossible to transplant one system from one country to another. And then the main difference between China and America is the level of intelligence. That difficult problem of succession to executive power in the republic might be solved by a people which has a high general intelligence. So you can have democracy if your people have higher level of intelligence. And that little hope may be entertained of a successful solution of the question of presidential succession in a country where the intelligence of the people is not high. So the grade of intelligence of the people in both America and France is comparatively speaking high. And then China is a country which has for centuries been accustomed to autocratic rule, and the intelligence of the great mass of the people is not high. So democracy is for high intelligence people, not for you folks who are not having the adequate intelligence. You mess things up. And actually before that, he's not a China expert. He wrote about North and South America and to explain why the democracy works in North America but not in the South America, by just saying the same thing, that in South American, people are having lower intelligence. They mess things up. So you let them vote, let them have the say, they mess things up. So it is why it doesn't work. But of course, in US, you need to know about the context. It is not a very uncommon view. It is a Jim Crow era. That voting right and women voting is not established yet at that time. So in the counter-propaganda against the universal suffrage campaign, for example, among the women, and they will say that women are emotional, they don't have the rational calculation and intelligence. to make rational decisions. So if you let them vote, they will pick for like bad candidates. So only men can vote. And property men, men with property, that if you don't own anything, you don't have voting right. It is very common in the early days of democracy. So it is white men with property who can vote. And then the theory is that only white men with property has the intelligence high enough to exercise democratic rights. Ethnic minority, African American, and African American at that time in the Jim Crow era, they are excluded from voting by a literacy test. They don't explicitly say that it is race, but then they say that it is literacy test, because you cannot pass a literacy test, you cannot vote. So it is this kind of the idea. It is very common. In its time, that actually democracy is a white privilege, white man privilege, or white property, white man privilege. It is not a universal mandate, so it extends internationally. So there's these dark-skinned people that naturally they would assume that they would not have the rational reasoning capacity and intelligence high enough to exercise democratic right. So it is very, very, very common idea. And of course, that good now that to his defense that he's more sophisticated than that, because he keep also saying that why this Chinese people don't have high intelligence. He didn't talk about gene and genetic and anything that is already starting to become common in the early 20th century. He talked about education. So because it's a lack of mass education, so a lot of people are not educated. Maybe we need to wait until they got educated. So it is like not genetically inferior, but like education. But then later on, so after the Yuan Shikai restoration of the monarchy failed, of course, that Frank Goodnow focused on his job as the president of the university, but then he continued to write about China, and this is the book that he wrote published in 1926, Johns Hopkins University Press, China, an Analysis, in which he elaborated on why Chinese people have a lower intelligence that cannot exercise democratic right, and then he drew on all this kind of Orientalist scholarship, very prominent at the time, by saying that it is the language of China, that it is ridiculous from today's standpoint, but it was, again, very common conception that because the Chinese language is not alphabet, it is not, there's no reason of it, you just need to memorize all the words, and then you occupy all your brain power. And then, so you don't have spare capacity to do reasoning. So they are not good at math, they're not good at physics and science, and let alone writing. So it is the very common the conception. Today we know it is ridiculous because we know that it is not a zero-sum mechanism in your brain. That you learn more language, like learn more music and things like that. Actually, you open up area of the brain that you can become smarter. So learn Chinese, you can become smarter. But then back then they have this kind of very zero-sum conception or mechanical conception of the brain that you spend all the time like learning the words and then you cannot do anything else. And actually it's a very common idea, so much so that actually people forgot about it, but there's recently 2 books about it. Actually, that the radical modernizing of China after the May 4th movement. So the whole movement about abolishing the Chinese, first the traditional Chinese and established like the grammar, Western grammar structure in Chinese language. And then actually the Communist Party of China, the program is that to abolish characters, to use Pinyin alphabet as a kind of a new language that actually Vietnam established. And also Korea and Japan also in their modernization, they also buy into this idea and then try to get rid of the Chinese characters, only put it in the kind of artistic thing, but in the daily use that they use alphabet. So that is the radical modernists of China. They actually advocate abolishing. They believe in this kind of Chinese characters and Chinese language is a kind of detrimental to Chinese progress. But actually, that is his view. But actually, it's very interesting that in the American Political Science annual meeting, that Frank Goodnow talked about this reform in China, why the democracy won't work and things like that. And the speech was published in the American Political Science Review. At the same time, that it is amazing, in the early 20th century, that they already sense that it might have some problem with this view. So they asked a kind of Indian scholars teaching in University of Iowa to do a rejoinder to this view. So he's Hindra Bose, teaching University of Iowa, and then he actually very strongly that imagine a colored person in Midwest, and then you are facing the founding father of political science, and then you come out and say you're wrong, that you're wrong about China, you're wrong about Asia, because I know that in the tradition of China and also in India and Asia in general, there are also moments of protest and democratic tradition. And in the end, so it's this guy, and it is his picture when he's posing with Tagore, when Tagore was visiting the US, that is the Nobel Prize winner in literature from colonial India. And in the end, the last paragraph is amazing. That again, there's a kind of a relatively junior scholar, migrant scholar from India in Iowa, and then facing the founding father of the American Political Science Association and the discipline, and saying that to conclude, I challenge the assumption that representative forms of government are the monopoly of the West. I resent the implication that the Orientals are in any essential manner different from the Occidentals. We of the East ask only one thing of the West. It is this, that you of the West stay away from us and your problems and our problems. Leave us to solve our own problems, to work out our own destinies, while you spend your time looking after yours. The greatest good you can do to us, the lasting benefit you can confer on us, is to let us alone. And we will have democracy if you leave us alone. So it was the agenda of the Woodrow Wilson administration after the League of Nations, after the First World War and things like that. So it's fascinating that Woodrow Wilson is like a controversial figure, but that he in terms of international relations, he opened up the conversation about self-determination, but he's talking about self-determination of the former constituents of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, but then a lot of people in colonial Vietnam, colonial Korea got the idea, and also the May 4th people in China said that we should have self-determination too, but then the Western powers say that, no, we are not talking about you, we are talking about the white people's self-determination. Like you people just stay calm and things like that. So, and then it is in this context that the Bose make this strong argument that it's not that we cannot have democracy. It is you that the Western power prevent us having democracy. If you leave us alone, we will have democracy. So that I'm toward the end of my presentation, that because I jumped all the way to 21st century, it's interesting. 20th century and then 21st century, and the connection is this guy, Li Dazhao. It is the founding father of the Chinese Communist Party, co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party. And then he's the guy who translated the Communist Manifesto into Chinese in the 1920s. And after the 19 May 4th movement. But in 1914, he published this, it is in Chinese, but then it is very interesting that 1914, his first published article is to attack Frank Goodenough. And then this article is called Guoqing, on national condition. He said, like, it's a rubbish talk about China has a special national condition, that democracy doesn't fit us. Because he's saying that when we talk about national condition, we are talking about our history, far away from today. You say that we have this national condition so that we don't have the right or we don't have the capacity to have this and that. It's just telling us because of our history, we cannot do this and that in the present and aspire for things for the future. So it's letting our own history to become a kind of a whole on what we are aspiring now and what we can have in the future. And human is progressing, right? And so the national condition talk should not be valid and cannot be repeated, because if you keep repeating it, it means that what you have in the past is what you can have in the future, so it is bad. We want progress. We want to get rid of our past and then we move on to the future. So actually it is his idea against this Guoqing Lun, that's like on national condition. And interestingly, that Li Dazhao, of course, that he is the founding father of the Communist Party. So in the 120th birthday of him in 2009, the CCP has this big celebration of his birthday, and then Xi Jinping at that time was a vice president, not yet the president of China and the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And then he made a speech about Li Dazhao, and actually he summarized Li Dazhao for this exactly opposite of what Li Dazhao is saying, that Li Dazhao is great because he emphasized that any developmental path has to fit Chinese condition. We cannot copy Western thing, but actually it's exactly opposite what Li Dazhao said. But it nobody matter because nobody read the original Li Dazhao So it is politically correct to, and then he's shaking hands with some of the descendants of the dictator and things like that. And then all the way to today, you see this like it is during the pandemic. And after the pandemic and contemporary China, you see a lot of justification of what they are doing, like centralizing, securitizing the state, is that because Chinese people love collectivism. We always think about the collective and listen to the leaders rather than thinking about our selfish individual interests. So Western individualism is bad. It's bad for the West now because there's a declining Western power because everybody's so selfish and only think about themselves. In China, that we are great, we are much better because we have a collective culture, we listen to our leader, we are sticking together. So it is this kind of myth, actually, you can trace back to people like Frank Goodnow. Of course, Frank Goodnow didn't read Chinese and didn't read Chinese culture. He's just citing people of his time, like Weber and all these sinologies and Indologies, of course, at the same time, Orientalists in general. So this very Western-originated, even you can say a racist kind of conception that the Chinese people cannot have this and that because of their special condition. But now it is adopted by the authoritarian leader. Actually, it is not surprising because before democratization, it is what the dictators in Taiwan and in South Korea is talking about as well, that, oh, democracy doesn't fit us. We are Chinese, we are Confucianists, and we are Asian values. So we cannot have democracy, we will mess up. But in the end, that they successfully democratized, and you look at the democracy score or freedom score or whatever, the Freedom House score, actually that Taiwan and South Korea is always very high, and sometimes, and in many times higher than a lot of traditional Western countries. So it means that this kind of a national condition talk, it really doesn't matter when you really democratize. So, but now that it is this kind of a self-orientalization, become a very important ideas that justified the contemporary authoritarian regime. And my last slide is this, that Alexander Dogin, who is the advisor of Putin, and he's talking about the Oriental and Asiatic origins of Russian civilization. He's advocating that Russia is never part of the West. We are great because we are influenced by the Mongol invasion. We get the Asiatic culture influence, so we are collectivists. We are strong, we're sticking together. So he's talking about this Greek Asianism. And now that he's having a good relation with the Chinese intellectuals who advocate this kind of the Greek non-Western Asiatic revival, that Russia being part of the Asiatic sphere now, that according to this Alexander Dogin conception. And this kind of a East versus West confrontation now is in the language of the ideologue of both the Putin regime and the CCP regime. And again, ironically, this kind of thing originated in this kind of Orientalist paradigm. You can date back to Hegel, and if not earlier, that is always this kind of a despotic East versus the individualist free West. So in the end, so it is a very much like a self-orientalization project that they borrow some of the most horrible conception about East-West difference from the Enlightenment all the way to modern times when the Western intellectuals already abandoned it. Now it is well and alive, being revived in all these kind of Asiatic or self-identified Asiatic authoritarian regimes. And then where is it going to lead us to? That I don't know. But then one danger is that if you emphasize this kind of confrontation between East and West, Russia, Ukraine war, and China confrontation with U.S. And as I said, it is a political economic condition that structure this confrontation. But then when you try to culturalize it and try to see it as a confrontation between civilizations, that it is dangerous because it will have kind of a racist connotation, and then it will affect the Asian diaspora and Chinese diaspora in Western country, and also the Westerner being in China and all those places, and then it becomes it will make the confrontation become more difficult to reconcile when it gets to this kind of a cultural understanding of it. So the only implication of it, or my only advice, is that try to debunk this kind of a cultural root of this confrontation, and then to look to the real foundation of this deterioration of relation and confrontation by looking at the political economy and other kind of social condition rather than some essentialist conception of culture. So it is what I want to share in those slides, but I look forward to the conversation and your question. But thank you for your patience. Thank you for your attention.
And I should say, I was a bit surprised because so much of your work that I've read is really about the hard realities of political economy, about class structures and state formation and how these things work and interact. And we'll get to that in a moment. But your talk today was really about ideas, ideologies, Orientalism. And I guess the first question to ask you is, and it's sort of in the preface of your new book as well, you say that, in the West there has been an oscillation, a sort of swinging of the pendulum between either Sinophobia, that China
Yes.
is this fundamentally different country, culturally, civilizationally, and so on. It's Confucian ethos and so on and so forth. That makes it very hard for it to become it's a modern country clearly, but not one that we identify in a Western sort of understanding or paradigm. So you have that on one hand, and then on the other hand, it swings to Sinophilia, that it's this great, powerful country, and we have a lot to learn from it. And clearly, the reality and the truth is a much more nuanced, complex version in between. I'm sort of struck by that. You talked about the former president of the American Political Science Association, but then you sort of think today, President Trump openly talking about his admiration for Xi Jinping and many other strongmen and so on. So it's a big question, but if you had a brief answer, what explains for you the sort of the swing in sort of elite opinion and maybe public opinion, if it's different, towards China, that the views of China from the West?
Yeah, that is very interesting because the book is about 800 years back and forth swing. And then I start the project like 25 years ago and look at the contemporary fantasy about China and then this back and forth. And then I dig deeper and deeper and find that actually we see this recurrence of swings between like extreme fantasy about China and admiration of China to the extreme like despise and contempt of China. It's like very repetitive over the centuries. And then I think one key thing is that China and many other Asian civilization, it is far away from Western civilization, from the medieval period all the way. So they can, and until very recently, there's not many people visiting the place. So that like Marco Polo went there and then only one direct account, first-hand account, and everybody believe in it. So it is very easy to simplify things, to like take a little bit of thing here and there and then create a very unified, simplistic picture of what China is. And then you look at the people who say admiration thing about China and people who say very bad thing about China. They basically, the description is not different. Like for example, in the 18th century, when Corneille, that is the founding father of the Physical School of Economics in France, they talk about China is so great, France should imitate China. And then the title of his book talking about the Chinese economy is talking about despotism in China in the positive sense. So this despotism is good, actually. China is so prosperous because of despotism. So it is the same talk that like in 2000s when people saying that why China is so populous, the economy is so booming because they have a strong state, they control the people, and then the people don't complain, and then it swallow the bitter pill necessary for economic advance. And actually in my book, the first page is a quotation from Donald Trump back in 2008 when he was not yet in politics, but then in 2008 in a kind of a hospital industry conference in New York, he say, oh, I just came back from China, they're so great, because they poured tons of dirt into the river and to build things. And I'm asking the constructor, oh, how can you get the environmental permit for this? And then the guy is telling Trump, what permit? There's no such thing. And then Trump come back and tell the people, you see, it's how they build stuff, no environmental permit. And then he keep on saying, now in New York City, I throw a stone in New York City in the Hudson River, I get an electric chair. It is exact wording. That so it's why the US is so screwed up, because we are not like China. We should be like China. This despotic regime is so great. So it is the same. And 10 years later, when the relation is not so good and people use the same description, saying that China is so obedient, collectivist, despotic, so it is not really free market, so everything is wrong about it. So the conception that everything is right about China, or everything is wrong in China, they rely on the same description, very simplistic description. Again, that they only scratch the surface, and then in the scholarship, we already know that there's a multi-layer of the regimes, and then people and different sectors of the society and different regions, they have different way to evade the government authority and things like that. So this very, very complicated picture, but that is a complicated picture that is very difficult to convey to the public. So in the end, from Marco Polo all the way to today, that we always in the popular presses, in books and bestseller, we only see the simplistic picture. No matter whether it is praising China or saying everything is bad in China, they rely on the same simplistic picture. So my core and then advice is actually that to swallow the bitter pill of to understand the nuance and
understand
the complexity and all this kind of multi-layered complexity of China and all other Asian societies.
Right. So there are these caricatures of China that are persistent. Tell us a little bit about your first book was Protests.
Yes.
With Chinese characteristics, all the way back to the Qing dynasty, so over hundreds of years, centuries. And my own study of China is much more limited in every sense of that word. But I looked at particularly the period in the post-Maoist period.
Yeah.
And I was really struck, in the 1980s, as you say, that first image was a democracy wall. It was, a desire to have the fifth freedom as opposed to Deng Xiaoping's four freedoms, for instance. And that was repressed. But then in the 1990s, you had an expansion of personal freedoms under Deng Xiaoping and other leaders, the expansion of the law, rights activists and organizations, a lot of environmental protests, for instance, a women's movement in China. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about ideas of freedom and liberty in the Chinese intellectual tradition. I'll just preface this by saying, I remember a very senior China scholar, a colleague of Ho-fung's would be Liz Perry, who once wrote a piece about the Chinese conceptions of rights, which are different. They draw on the Confucian tradition, a Maoist tradition. Tell us a little bit about what animates what we read about these incredibly brave, courageous dissidents, activists over the last 20, 30 years who are pushing for liberalization and democracy in China.
Yeah, the first book is coming straight out from my dissertation, so it is the product of the 2000s, 2010s discussion. At that time, China was booming. Everybody suddenly realized that China was booming. Market economy is booming, becoming a leading economy in the world. So at that time, the conversation is that in history in China, that many historians, social historians in China are saying that, so you know that historians look into history many times from a contemporary perspective. So when China was backward, so the historians are talking about why China was backward, so what Western society used to have and China didn't have in the Ming-Qing period. But then in 2000s, after people realized China is doing so great economically, the fashion in the historical studies of China is to look at actually what Western Europe had in the 16th to 19th century, and actually China also had those. So everything is actually is about the same. So the rise of the West, industrialization and the lack of industrialization in China in the 19th century was just a very minor accident. So China is just going back to the normal place of the world that is a big economic power. So it is the atmosphere at that time. But then I did the dissertation and wrote a book and tried to put a break on this conversation. Wait, we need to look at the nuance, the complexities, and actually the real difference, and if there's any real difference between, despite the similarity between early modern China and early modern Europe. And so it's a Qing dynasty, 18th century, and I find that it's very interesting. There's a lot of protests at that time. There's not only peasant rebellion, that the literature the Marxist historiography is emphasizing the peasant rebellion, large-scale rebellion. But actually, there's also a lot of urban protests, like workers' protests going on strike. And then little merchants are not happy with the government regulations and certain policies, so they go on market strike. They shut down the market to force the local government to change the policy and things like that. So it's look like about the same as what's happening in Europe about all these urban protests. And Charles Tilly and many other people talk about the origin of Western democracy is this kind of Western protest, urban protest. And China also had those. But then I find this one interesting thing is that in China that the centralized imperial power was always in place against the local power and provincial power, so that this conception of justice of this protester, even though on surface it looked like the Western protest, urban protest, but then they adopt a conservative Confucianist language of we are complaining about the local officials and we are repeating the emperor, and the emperor and the protesters share the same language. The emperor was the grandfather, and then local officials is the parents, and then the people were the grandkids. So it is the family hierarchy in which this protester portrayed themselves as a kind of a little grandkids complaining about their parents to their grandparents, and then they are mistreating us, so please do justice to us. So it is very hierarchical. So it is this conception that drives this protest. So even in today China, that in the 1990s and 2000s, there's a lot of documentation of present urban and rural protests. They have this very interesting repertoire of protests that's kneeling in front of the government and then pleading, and then also going all the way to Beijing to complain about local government. So it's very much similar. But again, at the same time, it is one part of the Confucianist tradition, as I said in the presentation. There's also, at a point in 16th century, there's a liberal wings of Confucianism that flower. They try to subvert this hierarchical conception of political power, modeling after familial hierarchy of patriarch and parents and children, and advocate peer friendship. So there's a huge Confucianist literature in 16th and 17th century China talking about like a gentleman shouldn't have only one vertical relation with their senior people, but they should have a peer friendship fraternity. So it is like really a kind of a fraternity idea of French Revolution. It's like horizontal, equalitarian relation. But then it was shut down after the Qing dynasty established themselves. They think that is heretic, and then they shut down the academy that studied this kind of alternative liberal branch of Confucianism, and then we established the most orthodox and hierarchical version of Confucianism. That the mid-20th century, a group of Confucianists in exile in my alma mater, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, trying to revive, and later help. Actually, it's fermented when part of them are in Taiwan, and they also help create an atmosphere and have their magazine for the early democratic movement under the Chiang Kai-shek dictatorship in the 50s and 60s. So it is a lot of complication, but also there's also a big difference between the West and the East in early modern times.
So before we open up, let's ask one more question, but just summarize. So there's an intellectual contest even within the Confucian tradition. I take it that Xi Jinping and those that support him today, are very much in this conservative tradition of paternal authority, what you call in some of your early work familial statism, the idea that you can protest, but you're really asking the person in charge to take care of your problems. But then there's this liberal tradition. Just want to shift, before I open it up for questions and comments, we have so many here in the audience, to shift to the other part of your work. So intellectual history is a long sweep, but then so much of your work is on global political economy and the Chinese political economy. And in your work, you talk about not just problems, but contradictions, which you call structural contradictions in the model. And we see this happening now increasingly in China, that, as I was saying, growth is slowing, debt's accumulating. There are certain phenomena you read about. We saw it during the pandemic. It was quite striking. You talk about, that was a different kind of protest. I don't know how many of you remember the white paper protests, where people were protesting against the public health protocols, which were incredibly strict, the most strict in the world. And it erupted in many cities, and particularly Shanghai became an epicenter. And because because the virus got out of control and protests were rising to such a crescendo, I mean, virtually overnight, maybe over a weekend or a week, the state just, the most strict public health protocols were simply undone. And the virus just went rampant. We have no idea just what its impact was. When you think about that as an event, and you think about this, the problems facing China today in its economy, do you see any sort of pressure points in which, I guess let me first question, what are the prospects of the regime today for its own survival? You were saying in some of this earlier work that the regime is clamping down under Xi Jinping because it's inherited these problems of corruption and inequality from the past, and it has to address them. But is there a set of incentives or pressures facing the regime today for its own survival of the party that it would seek to liberalize some aspects of politics and society? Once again, like it did under Deng Xiaoping. We remember the tragedy of Tiananmen, but then in the 90s there was an expansion of personal freedoms as well. So do you see that possibility arising?
I think in the short run, I'm very pessimistic about it. That because people who are optimistic in the 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they're always proven wrong. So it is very difficult to be optimistic about this. And also looking at the examples of, and China is learning very well that there's a rumor that before Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, I don't think it's verified, but it's all this kind of overseas dissident Chinese media keep saying that Hu Jintao in one internal speech talking about politically we should learn from Cuba. And I don't think he on the record said that, but people believe that he said that. But I think it is reasonable that I think that they definitely learn from Cuba, they learn from Iran and learn from North Korea. Then of course there's protests like Iran, that every once in a while you see this kind of a university student and women, and they are coming up then against the regime, and you never know when the regime will come down, but so far so good in the short run. So they're trying to learn the lesson that the regime that is like try to soften a little bit, and people seize on the chance, and then it will become a kind of a flood, and then they cannot survive there, and then there will be regime collapse and things like that. They are very, very up against it, and then they are learning in very details the experience of the Soviet collapse.
Right, I was just thinking of that.
There's tons of books in 2000s about the Soviet disaster, what we can learn from it, literature. So they study it. So they're very, very clever in rounding up any seeds of discontent. And you speak of the white paper movement and things like that. They of course, Communist Party thrived in the early 20th century by linking up all these like protests here and there to become a national movement and topple the Kuomintang and seize power. So they know that this kind of a protest here and there became a threat when you have this kind of a connection point that link them together to become a kind of a challenge to the power, and if there's some elite collaborator in the regime, so that they are surgically going after this kind of a connection point that can connect this separate protests here and there, and also running up any suspected collaborator within the regime. So it's why all these purges all the time. So they are very surgically and very adamantly doing it and doing a good job in it. So I don't think in the short run that there's much space because like after the white paper and the A4 protests, then they rang up and also they not only rang up people from within, because they know that the protests were organized with this kind of overseas Chinese student who used their social media account as a kind of a information clearinghouse. People in one province in mainland China send a message or whatever image to that person in overseas, and then he put it in his own social media account, and other people jump across the firewall to get it. And then now the guy is famous in Italy. That there's a lot of report about that guy. And then there's this transnational repression going after these people overseas now. So they are very careful about what would be the problem or potential problem. So they weed it out before it became a real problem. But then the upcoming point of uncertainty, of course, that unless Xi Jinping and Putin join hands to find a way to live beyond 150 years old, as they discussed recently, they still need to face the lateral reality of aging and eventually passing away. So there's always this kind of if you have, because before Xi Jinping, there's Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, there's a very orderly succession, there's a plan, elite consensus, but now Xi Jinping obliterate all this and then making himself a de facto lifelong leader, then when it is obvious that he become aging and cannot exercise his power as before and eventually pass away, then that will be a kind of a point of uncertainty. I'm not saying that there will be liberalization and democratization. Maybe it will be worse, that it will be somebody come along and then doing worse things, but then it will be uncertainty, for the better, for the worse. But we need to get ready for that. That will eventually come. Again, I'm not saying that is impossible, but it's still possible that he will live beyond 200 years old and we don't have this problem.
Well, the question of secession is always major, and I'm always struck at how many times in the past observers have said, this is the crisis that will finally bring China down, its regime, and yet it surmounts, it has this remarkable adaptability. I just say this neutrally, I'm not endorsing it kind of morally, but has this ability to sort of survive many crises.